Tactics change, strategies change, mission doesn't. This is the Extreme Stewardship Podcast, where we explore anything and everything that gets us better at making things good and good at making things better. Right now, I'm interested in getting better at knowing, understanding, and acting on the commander's intent. Meaning, God has sent us on a mission, and we need to know what that mission is, why we're doing it, and what the basic parameters are for how we're going to get it done. Back in episode 33, I suggested that God's communicating of his intent in the Bible looks a lot like what Jocko Willink calls decentralized command. Decentralized command means putting real-time decision-making capability as low on the org chart as possible so that people with boots on the ground can take action on the ground. The connection to the commander's intent is this. The commander should communicate their intent, which means the mission, the reason for the mission, and the broad strategic parameters, and let the people on the ground make strategic and tactical decisions that are in keeping with that commander's intent. And my point in that earlier episode was that God does precisely this. He gives us the mission. He gives us the reason for the mission. He gives us the broad parameters within which we are going to accomplish the mission, and then he invites us to figure things out from there. Love God and love neighbor. That's the mission. 10 Commandments. That's the highest possible altitude on how we accomplish the mission. Covenant code in Exodus, holiness code in Leviticus, instructions in Deuteronomy. These are slightly lower altitude on the how, but still far removed from tactical micromanagement. In this episode, I'm going to talk through how the Bible and the early church navigate the difference between mission, strategy, and tactics as it relates to how Jesus and the apostles come along and say things that sound like we're not supposed to do all the things that God told us to do in the Holiness Code and those other parts of Israel's law. So, God's law to Israel, one more time, it starts with the one. The one God is our God, and our God is the only God. Then the two, love God and love neighbor. Then the 10 Commandments. Then the many, all the rest of the laws. But jump ahead 1,000 years or so and see what happens when Jesus comes on the scene. The first thing that happens by that time is we're going to see that zoom in process, the move from 1 to 2 to 10 to lots. That process is going to continue beyond where the biblical text of the Old Testament stopped. When the Gospels mention the tradition of the elders in Mark chapter 7, for example, they're talking about Jews taking the laws of Deuteronomy and going more and more and more tactical with them. Deuteronomy is still pretty broad, so over time, things got specific. The command says, don't work on the Sabbath. Deuteronomy spells out a few things that could count as work on the Sabbath, but that leaves a ton of gray area. So by the time Jesus comes on the scene, we've got way more clarity, way more black and white, way less gray. The rabbis say this counts as work on the Sabbath, but that doesn't. They say you can walk this far, but no farther. You can do this activity, but not that one. And apparently, Jesus doesn't like this. In Mark 7, the point of bringing up the tradition of the elders is that those traditions have effectively undermined the commands they were meant to implement. In Mark chapter 7, verse 10, Moses said, honor your father and mother. But you say, this is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, you Pharisees say, anyone who declares that what might have been used to help their father is devoted to God, you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. So there was this tradition about devoting things to God, which sounds like a solid idea, that in fact prevented people from carrying out the mission, which was honor your father and mother. And if the tactic undermines the mission, it's the wrong tactic, no matter how bright it might sound by itself. And here's another example, Mark chapter 2. The disciples picked some heads of grain on the Sabbath, which somewhere along the way was one of the things that people started counting as work on the Sabbath because it was harvesting a crop. The Pharisees flip out, and Jesus says this, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now, what does that mean? It means The commander's intent behind the Sabbath was to benefit the people of Israel. Look at Deuteronomy 5, where the Ten Commandments were spoken. You were slaves in Egypt. Now you're not slaves, so have a Sabbath. Sabbath is a gift to those who have been enslaved. It is a gracious invitation to step away from work. But the micromanagement of the Pharisees had turned it into a burden. You spend every waking moment on the Sabbath trying not to accidentally do something that might count as Sabbath breaking. The tactical moves at the ground level have missed the point of the mission. If you think eating some grain or healing a person, as Jesus would do in the next part of Mark's gospel, if you think that's breaking the Sabbath, you don't understand the commander's intent for the Sabbath. So when Jesus said people were neglecting the weightier things of the law for the sake of their traditions, what he means is they're going hard on perfecting their tactics without paying attention to the mission. And the reason they did that, and the reason we do that today, is that we have forgotten the commander's intent. Now, there's another thing that happens in Jesus' day and then unfolds a little more in the early church, in Acts and in the various letters from Paul and other people. We've got this structure in the Old Testament. 1, our God is the only God is our God. Then 2, love that God and therefore love neighbor. Then 10, the 10 Commandments. Then many, but not that many really. The Old Testament does paint some very specific scenarios, but the point of that specificity is not to micromanage. The point is to give illustrations of tactical decisions that accomplish the mission. A handful of illustrations, not a comprehensive tactical playbook so that you can simply chapter and verse your way through life. Not even close. And when early Jews tried to create that playbook, Jesus pointed out all they'd accomplish was nitpicking their way right out of line with the mission. But then here's the second thing that happens. Jesus and the apostles go a bit further. They actually back away from some of that last biblical framework, what I'm calling the many. That's the law in Deuteronomy, the holiness code in Leviticus 17 through 26, and the covenant code in Exodus 21 through 23. Jesus and the apostles start saying that eating food that's been sacrificed to idols might actually be okay under some circumstances. They start saying that it doesn't even matter if your day of rest, your Sabbath, is Saturday. They start acting like taking sin offerings to the temple is just not something we're doing anymore. Those things aren't the tradition of the elders. Those things are right there in the Old Testament. So this is a bit different because Paul, for example, is not saying stop micromanaging and let people Sabbath on whatever day they want to, because it was God himself who picked Saturday in the first place. Let's come at this by recognizing that God in history works in different ways at different times with different people. There was a period of time in which God routed his mission through a nation, a political entity with one government, one law, and one language, and one ethnic identity. That was God's plan for that period of time. And to call it that, to call the whole nation of Israel phase of the biblical story a plan for a period of time, is to say that Israel was never the mission. It was never God's ultimate end game to pull one ancestrally defined group of people out from all the other groups of people and just work with them. Israel was the strategy, not the mission. Now, if saying God works in different ways at different times with different people bothers you a bit, maybe it sounds like God can't quite make up his mind what he's trying to do. Think of it this way. Let's say my mission is to get from Spokane, Washington, to my parents' home in Chiang Rai, Thailand. The mission is to go from A to B. The strategy is the broad framework for how I'm going to do that. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to drive to the airport in Spokane. Then I'm going to fly from Spokane to Seattle, Seattle to Seoul, Korea, and from Seoul to Chiang Mai, Thailand. And then I'm going to drive from Chiang Mai to Chiang Rai, where my parents live. Notice how my strategy went from driving to flying and then back to driving. If I'm being nitpicky, I could even say that I'm going to drive to my parents' home, but then to actually get in the house, I have to get out of the car and walk. So there are multiple strategic phases of the mission. And no one would say, if they saw me in a car going from Chiang Mai to Chiang Rai, no one would accuse me of not being able to make up my mind. Hey, I thought you were going to fly here. We wouldn't do that. Likewise with God, perhaps. The fact that God makes strategic shifts doesn't mean he can't make up his mind or doesn't know what he's doing. It means he's using strategies and tactics that make sense within any given phase of the mission. Kind of like it makes sense for me to drive to the airport and then fly over the ocean and then walk in the front door. So all I'm saying is that a tactic that makes sense within one strategic context might not make sense within another strategic context, even if the mission hasn't changed. And a strategy at one stage of the mission might not make sense at another stage of the mission. Same mission, different strategy. Same mission, different tactics. True for us, true for God. When Jesus says we're going to do things differently now, he's not saying, oh, God finally figured out that wasn't going to work, so he's going for something new. He is saying new phase of the mission, not new mission, new phase of the same mission. The mission is love God, love neighbor. That doesn't change from Adam to Moses to David to Jesus to us. What does change is how we go about doing that. Same mission, different strategy, different tactics. Thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. My behind-the-scenes partner in this project is my brother, Ben Kibbe. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Leah Leanhoutz, and of course, music is provided by Dave Murray of Daradoon Guitars. If this series has been helpful or challenging to you, or if you've got a story about extreme stewardship that you'd be willing to share, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. You are, of course, welcome to like and subscribe and tell your friends and all that. What we really care about is that you have gotten better at making things good and good at making things better.